bit by bit over time. And it begins in the colonial era, when suffrage in British North America was certainly larger than in Europe, but it's still quite restricted by modern standards. And it was very, very diverse. So each colony, and often towns within each colony, had different laws, and they varied quite widely. Some colonies, for instance, let Native Americans vote, some let free blacks vote, some let Catholics and Jews and other non-Protestants vote, and others didn't. Some colonies specifically banned women from voting. In some places, women, particularly propertied widows, were able to vote. So it's a very mixed picture during the colonial era. The revolution and the constitutional era created a republic without really transforming the right to vote. The republic that ended monarchy, but did not immediately create democracy. At some point, and historians argue about exactly when this took place, that republic turned into a modern democracy. Historians usually point to the Jeffersonian era, and then more especially the Jacksonian period, when more and more white adult men gained voting rights. So the property restrictions that had prevented poorer white adult men from voting were removed or not implemented in the new states that were created in the West. Then we move into the Civil War, which enabled another expansion of voting rights, most notably the 15th Amendment that was ratified in 1850, that prohibited the federal government and the individual state governments from using race to deny US citizens the right to vote. And of course, we know poll tests and literary tests and so forth were put in place to prevent African Americans from voting until the Voting Rights Act, in the South especially, until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But essentially we see from the colonial period through the Revolutionary, then the Civil War, and then as we get into the 20th century, and especially with the 19th Amendment that gave women the vote, this successive expansion of the right to vote, of the suffrage, of who is able to vote in elections, and also who is able to hold political office. And this continues into the 20th century with the Civil Rights Movement and then the Voting Rights Act, to the point where by around the 1970s, the United States has effectively achieved universal adult suffrage, with some exceptions. For instance, in some states, citizens convicted of felonies are not allowed to vote. But for the most part, almost all adult citizens are legally entitled to vote by the 1970s in this country. So historians promoted that narrative, that linear progressive narrative, very, very heavily in the 1950s. They continued to promote in the second half of the 20th century. They argued about whether this progression was bloodless, or whether it was relatively smooth, or whether it was contested and how much struggle was involved. But essentially the outcome and the trajectory was not called into question. So what I want to put on the table to get us thinking today as part of our discussion of how history relates to the presidential election of 2020, and also how the presidential election of 2020 relates to US history, is whether or not we think at this particular moment in the mood and the sensibility and the division and the anxiety of an election that is being conducted amid a pandemic, whether that narrative, that rather comfortable narrative of linear progression towards increased democracy still holds, still seems relevant, still seems compelling. And if it doesn't, what will we replace it with? How might we rethink this long course of American democracy, of American democratic history, if we're not going to see it in that traditional way of being a upward trajectory over time? One solution, I think, would be to, instead of seeing an upward trajectory, to break US history into different phases, different compartments, some of which will be shaped by democratic advancement, some of which will be shaped by the opposite, retrenchment or retreat from inclusion and expansion of democratic practices and values. And I think this approach then will have the advantage of highlighting some of the contingency and agency that Obama was maybe implying when he referenced his own election in 2008, just a few days ago. And one model I can suggest would be something that historian Alexander Kaysar has used, a schema that he has presented in order to describe the development of the right to vote, the history of the right to vote in this country. And he broke that history into really 4.5 periods. The first runs from the revolution to 1850. And throughout that period, the United States remains, really until the very end of that period, a rural agricultural nation. And as I mentioned earlier, especially during the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian periods, the right to vote expands quite dramatically, but not in a straightforward way. Some people, women, for instance, in New Jersey, lose the right to vote. Plenty of Americans remain excluded from the right to vote. But adult white men gained the right to vote in quite substantial numbers. And it's within that context that de Tocqueville can write in the 1830s about democracy in America as being something new and modern and different from Europe. But then from 1850 through to World War I, things go in the opposite direction for white men. Industrialization and immigration mean that elites start to clamp down on voting rights, and they narrow the ability for even white men to be able to vote. Class conflict becomes a major problem. Ethnic tensions become a major problem, and within that context, voting rights become narrowed. And then we move into the post-World War I era. In 1920, women gain the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, and that practically doubles the size of the voting population in this country. But after that, from 1920 through really to the 1950s, the suffrage law remains pretty stable. The patterns of who can vote, the patterns of inclusion, the patterns of exclusion remain relatively stable. There's no great increase or reduction in the franchise. And then that all changes again in the 1950s with the civil rights movement that culminates in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that removes really all of the major legal restrictions on the right to vote, allowing the US to reach nearly universal adult suffrage, at least legally, by the 1970s. So those are the 4 phases that Kaysar maps out in his study of the right to vote in the United States. And I think the picture he paints is very different to a linear progression towards greater and greater votes. Instead, what happens is he emphasizes the ambiguity and the contest that is involved in each of these phases. There's no clear outcome, there's no clear direction. Some people win the right to vote, others lose the right to vote. The ultimate end goal is not clear. And I said that Kaysar describes 4.5 phases, and I've only laid out 4. So what's that half phase? Well, that's the phase we're in now, according to him. After the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act, and this achievement of nearly universal adult suffrage in the 1970s, we enter a fifth era, according to Kesar, an era of contestation, he calls it, in a polity with an already broad franchise and widespread democratic norms. And he wrote that before the election of Donald Trump. But he's still attuned to the idea that we're currently in an era of political contestation. Even though many people can vote, even though the franchise is very broad, there's a struggle for democracy. And that makes me wonder how things look from 2020, a few years later. Are we still comfortable with the conventional, traditional histories that you'll see in textbooks of United States history that you may have come across in surveys of US history, in Core 100 and other courses? This idea that the long history of American democracy has been toward expanding voting rights, allowing more and more people to vote, to be removing barriers. Or is the story more complicated? Is the history of voting and democracy in America more divided, more messy, less heroic, perhaps less certain, more confusing, more destructive? And I don't have any firm conclusions about that, but I think what the election of 2020 might help us do is help us reflect on that and to think about that. And so I encourage us, rather than to use history simply as a way to think about what is going on now and what